Nile, the rise of Arrakkamani. Part 2, the hidden Pharaoh. The man who was king of the southernmost city on the Nile was marching with an undefeated army up to the walls of the northernmost, the finest city in Egypt and indeed a contender for the finest in the known world, Alexandria. But Arrakkamani would not be able to simply walk into the capital of the mighty Ptolemaic Empire with a band of desert hunters. He faced mighty walls, guarded by men greater in number and richer in arms than he. For the lords of Ptolemai, this was where the madness would end. Their mistake was to assume any madness was afoot at all. Arrakkamani and his men turned back, and were seen marching south towards Memphis. But the agents of the Ptolemaics reported that not a single troop had arrived, or even been sighted on nearby roads weeks later. It was assumed that the despair set into the Medewi troops by Arrakkamani's reversing fortunes had shattered their already wavering discipline, and the army had scattered to the winds. Now then was the time for the humiliated Hellenites to wipe the dirt from their faces and start work to ensure that every written account of the whole affair was destroyed. That might have been the end of it if it hadn't been Arrakkamani they were dealing with. The Desert King's disappearing act was no rout and no accident. The first to learn of this was the noble Epinetus, commander of Alexandria's finest troops, with said troops being mere moments later the next 2,600 to learn of it. A storm of projectiles and a shrill, hammering war cry burst from the roadside cover into the sweating column of Ptolemaic troops. The light troops were not able to fight or flee, and so died by the dozen each meter the stampede of Medewi advanced. The horses and elephants lacked the grace to slip through the rain of javelins unscathed, and if the foot soldiers had any chance of avoiding the same fate, the panic robbed their wit to take it. The prouder troops would not be slaughtered with such ease, but compared to the tides of Medewi warriors flooding the road, they were mere driftwood. Their lives were carried away with the history of the day. But for those the great king allowed to run free, for their flight would betray not only their courage but their whole city. They sent word of Arrakkamani's return to the men within the walls, and these men, filled with a sense of duty and honour, sallied from the city to shield the return of their countrymen. But that shield felt ever smaller, yet heavier the closer Arrakkamani got. The Alexandrian men slowed their pace as their doubts grew, giving the Medewi vanguard a chance to catch up with their prey. Seeing his fortunes crushed, Epinetus was convinced to end his guilty flight and take up the lance in the spirit of Alexander himself. Most likely it was his companions who sought such a glorious end rather than he, for as soon as they had all perished, Epinetus fled the field to be the only survivor of the army he had raised. He knew better than to ever be heard from again after that. Unaware that their mission had already failed, the Alexandrian troops readied shields and spears in tight ranks to smash apart the Medewi rabble gathering before them. But like a turtle in its shell, their reassuring compactness left them at the mercy of the fast-moving southerners, who quickly surrounded them so that none could live in defeat. It was true indeed that Arrakkamani and his men had few tools fit to crack that turtle's shell, but the Nile itself would not sit idly by and allow its rightful king to falter. It is said that waters rose up from the ground beneath the feet of the Ptolemaic men, submerging them up to their necks, while beyond their ranks the desert sat dry and empty. Their shields were pulled afloat while their armour demanded to sink. Their perfect formations were opened as men struggled to even stand still, let alone continue an orderly advance. Yet meanwhile the Medewi men seemed to glide through the water like air, perhaps by the virtue of their light loadout, or perhaps by the grace of the same gods and spirits that had manifested the flood. One by one, the fighting men of Alexandria were slain as the Medewi noose tightened around their floundering opponent. Arrakkamani broke the back of his foe, and then leisurely tracked his way along the route those men had taken to quickly and safely arrive at the barely manned gates of his prize. On the same day, he found himself walking through the lavishly decorated halls of the Ptolemaic court, and sitting down on the stately chair that overlooked this space. In the streets of Alexandria and Medewi alike, some began to call him Pharaoh. He almost was. but his mandate was not fulfilled, even with this brilliant victory, for it had cost him Memphis, and the coastal city of Myos Hormos to the southeast still gave his enemies command over a considerable stretch of the Nile's eastern bank. The first hurdle had been lowered for him already, as the Ptolemaics had been forced to give an inexperienced local dynasty power over the lands around Memphis, Ta-Mehu as it was known. A war against Arrakkamani was far from the reach of their ambition. As for the second hurdle, it was cleared with ease by the rearguard commander Ozilkes, who gave up his post for a while to crush a Ptolemaic militia and claim Myos Hormos as his own, or for Medewi, as he would have been forced to put it. Meanwhile, Arrakkamani had been inspired by the weakness of the Ta-Mehu nobles to enact a similar deconstruction on other parts of the Ptolemaic Empire. He marched west along the coast to the ports at Paraitanion, where he installed an overlooked family as the royal dynasty of their own little kingdom, a kingdom that owed the debt of its very existence to the would-be pharaoh, of course. Alexandria was thus rendered secure from the west and south, and to the east the Nile itself barred any chance for a quick or unimpeded invasion. Arrakkamani could settle in and begin a scheme to bond Ta-Mehu to his direct rule, but his enemies, he found, were in his very camp. It was late at night, and the king was leaning out over the fence of the enclosure he had built every night for the comfort of the crocodile he had taken to travelling with, a beast secured from among the plunder at Diospolis, and a pet that appealed to his self-image of wisdom and strength. The crocodile, named Sobek after a crocodile-headed god of the Nile, was quite ferocious when anyone but Arrakkamani was nearby. Thus, the king was alone with the creature when it needed to be fed. And on this night in particular, a man with pockets weighed down with gold from Axum took the chance to introduce the unguarded king to a poisoned blade. He had not gone completely undetected, for the sudden agitation of Sobek had revealed that something was wrong. Arrakkamani had begun to turn just as the assassin arrived within arm's reach behind him. The thrust of the blade was made only glancing by the motion, piercing the skin and depositing its poison all the same. The king grabbed the attacker, who would have quickly noticed how the large strength and stature of his mark seemed all the greater from such a close vantage, and then hurled him with a great roar across the fence of dried palm into the wet ditches beyond. No further action was needed to punish the man for his crime, and were it not for the cut on his arm, Arrakkamani would have had no evidence of him existing at all. It was found that he was a member of the king's own guard company, no doubt paid by the nobles of Medewi to end the constant shift of power and privileges away from them and towards the increasingly legendary king. In the short term, they had succeeded. The poison, while not a deadly dose, left the king weakened and short of breath for many months. He withdrew into the city, leaving his army outside to see away any Ptolemaic raids on its own. Too ill even to play politics, it seemed to many that his fire had burnt out. Business continued on, and others took their chance to secure rank and responsibility within the Medewi bureaucracy. It was their chance to step from Arrakkamani's shadow and win spoils and praise for themselves. Yet, 1 year later, when Arrakkamani finally let out a great shout to command his guards to follow him out of the city, what had happened? The city itself was cowering in fear under a blockade by a huge Ptolemaic army. The king's army, paralysed with fear in the face of a powerful foe, and without anyone ambitious enough to solve this problem, had achieved nothing, not even putting down an uprising of rural families with an army at their back. And to the south, Ta-Mehu and its own upstart rebels were now openly warring with Medewi over a dispute had with Ozilkes, whose hunts and raids against Ptolemaic targets had not stopped at their borders. It was time to destroy any doubt that there was only one man Medewi could trust to lead them. Arrakkamani slipped past the sun-baked siege lines with a company of horsemen, quickly rejoining his army. He immediately destroyed the camp and marched them back the way he had rode, attacking the siege lines from the rear while the city guards sallied out to test them from the front. The heavy pike squares of the Ptolemaic army were surrounded and rendered useless. Over 2,000 men were killed and some 400 captured alive. The captives were sent back east to warn of the king's return, while the king himself marched west to stamp out all talk of rebellion. Still, he had to deal with the army fielded by Tamahu, now with fewer troops at his disposal. That was no problem, as he soon learned, for the leaders of Tamahu were inexperienced and greedy. Feigning great loss and chaos as the result of the encounters with the previous besiegers, he offered Tamahu a deal. They could have Alexandria, if only they would let him and his poor soldiers return south, return home. Overjoyed at this perfect offer, they accepted, marching with haste to set up their new and lucrative capital in the great city. And then Arrakkamani appeared, horses charging, fireballs rolling, arrows singing. On the side of a steep hill, overlooking the road, his army of painted warriors emerged, many now wearing armour by the allowance of the cooler climate. The camp followers trailing the main army were overrun by a charge of swordsmen and horses, fighting a one-sided battle that was lost within the minute. The rest of the army, the heavier troops, nervously turned their shield walls this way and that as the Medewi flowed around them, staying clear of the deadly phalanx troops while bombarding them with thrown spears. The army of Memphis knew it was better, the more disciplined, better equipped, and better drilled side. Yet nothing could be made of it. The hill slowed their march to a standstill, yet spears and arrows traversed the hillside as easily as anywhere else. The Medewi troops could deny them a chance to fight hand to hand until such a fight would be impossible to win. Company by company, the Tamahu forces were surrounded by the travelling swarm of Ethiopian light troops, and then systematically crushed and disintegrated by it. There would not be a chance to fight or to flee. Prayer and death was all that remained for those soldiers, and Arrakkamani watched the drama play out on that hillside with a smile, for now he had done all he needed to complete his dream. Weeks later, Memphis was his once again, and with it came complete control of the Nile. From source to sea there was a single king, an Ethiopian king, just as it had been 500 years ago, and if Arrakkamani had anything to say about it, just as it would always be.